I'm Koh Buck Song. I have what is called a portfolio career, which means I don't work in a regular job in one company, but I do a number of things. So I have a few streams of income. So I do writing, editing, some consulting, and some training. And I work in a few areas. One is in this area called the livable cities. Like, for instance, I do quite a lot of work for a government agency called the Center for Livable Cities. So what they're doing is promoting urban development and gathering and sharing the best ideas and best practices about how to make cities more livable. I also do a range of other writing for various organizations, mostly government agencies, but some private sector companies as well. Like, for instance, I recently did a project for Microsoft when the global CEO did a tour of Asia to promote public cloud computing for the non-profit sector. And I also do work in the fields of leadership and corporate social responsibility and helping various organizations to build their brand.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, so we learned from the Singapore Infopedia that your first ever poem was written in primary school, and it's called The Jetty. And was that the point where you decided that you had an interest in literature and poetry?
Yes. In some ways, it was actually a literary workshop focusing on poetry, organized by a publisher for young people in Singapore to attend and then learn more about literature and try to create literature. And I think for me, looking back, it had quite a formative effect on me, because it was something that made me think more about writing poetry and creating literature and doing more to promote its appreciation.
Okay, so what was like the point where you decided to be a poet, or like to pursue a profession in just literature stuff?
Actually, I was writing it more as a hobby.
Okay.
It was only when I was in my late 20s, when I was then working as a newspaper journalist, and I had a regular opinion column. It appeared every other week, and it was a place where I could write an essay about practically any topic under the sun, something that I felt concerned about.
Okay.
And a publisher actually approached me to consider putting together a book of poems. So that was what really got me to thinking about putting it together and having it published. This was in 1992, my first collection of poems.
Oh, so like we know from interviews and like websites that you studied at 3 different universities, in Harvard, University of London, Cambridge University. And can you share with us like the biggest lessons you learned from each university, and how like each university influenced your decisions for your later profession?
Well, Cambridge University was where I went for my first degree in literature. I would say that biggest a takeaway from that whole experience in terms of writing and literature is the university experience as a whole was that you're really on your own, because Cambridge is a place where the way that they teach, you're really left on your own. There's really very little what is called spoon feeding. You really have to go and depend on your own resources and initiative to go and look for information and knowledge and put it together. And some of the times it was a bit lonely. It's quite a lonely experience because especially as you get to the third year, which is when you choose your own areas of specialization. And in Cambridge, the tutorials it's a ratio of 2 students to 1 faculty.
Wow.
So it's not a big class. It's 2 to 1. And in the third year, it's even worse. Most of my tutorials were 1 to 1 because and it's also there's a collegiate system. So if in your college you're the only person picking a certain specialization, like for instance modernism in literature, then I would go to tutorials all by myself.
Wow.
And you're almost like you have nobody to discuss anything with. You're really on your own. So you really learn to be independent and self-sufficient and resourceful. So that's the biggest thing that I learned from being at Cambridge in the UK. After that, I went to London University. I was actually on a government scholarship,
okay.
And I was meant to be trained in education to go back to Singapore to work in the field of education. I would say that one of the biggest lessons from that experience is that it's really not easy to teach. Teaching is a very difficult skill, and I don't think it comes naturally to me, so I really found it a struggle. I mean, that's partly why I switched paths and became a journalist instead. Because, quite a lot of the times as a journalist, you are asking the questions. And later when I left journalism, later in life, when I left journalism and worked in communications and consulting, helping others to handle their media relations and build their brand, I learned that it is much more difficult to answer questions than to ask them. So that was my biggest takeaway from London. From Harvard, I guess you could just summarize it in one idea. It would be how globally connected we all are. I mean, like I was in a class of the mid-career masters in public administration, and most of us had already worked for some years. We were taking a break in our careers. There were like 200 over classmates that I had, and you really learn how we all face common challenges and how the world is really interconnected, and we really have to depend on each other in order to build a better world. That's the takeaway from Harvard.
Okay. And when you're like studying overboard at different schools, like how would you describe like meeting different people and making connections, and like how those connections have like influenced later on in your profession?
Yes, I think probably the best example I could give is from Harvard, because when I was there, I focused on leadership as a subject, and the way that it is taught there, you learn as much from your classmates as from the professor. So that's where I really got to look at things from the social perspective. Because earlier in my life, when I was a journalist, I did that for 11 years full time. About half that time I was in the arts section. I looked at things from a more artistic, cultural perspective. And then the rest of the time I was on the political desk. I looked at things from a political perspective. After I left the Straits Times, I worked for a government agency called the Singapore Economic Development Board, which was not only in charge of attracting foreign investments to Singapore, but also the country's national economic strategy. So I was looking at things from a macroeconomic perspective. So I guess the missing piece was the social perspective, and that's how I mainly looked at things when I was at Harvard. And this led to my growing interest in looking at things from the social perspective as well, and to what I've done since then in the social space. For instance, being I was part of the support faculty for a leadership executive program that's run in Singapore on a national basis for senior executives who work in the social services space, and also other work that I've done, for instance, consulting to non-profit organizations to help them to build their brand and to become more effective as an organization.
That's very interesting. So I'm gonna go more into your writing career now for my questions. And well, for writing, whether it's poetry or fiction and nonfiction, it could be really personal. And was there any point of like your publishing where like you don't know whether you should publish something or not, and like how do you differentiate if something is like presentable to the public or if it's like private to yourself or like should be censored?
Well, because I worked as a journalist and also in my public service advising the government on media censorship policy, I've always been quite acutely aware of the need for censorship. I think, well, that's what editing is all about. I mean, you actually you may not use the word, but in effect, that's what you're doing. You are censoring the work, editing it. There are a few aims of editing. One, of course, is to make it more accurate and more easily understood. But there's also the aspect of editing that is making it more acceptable to the audience. So that's something that I've always been very aware of. I mean, as a journalist, you have to do it on a daily basis, and with practically every word that you write, especially there's no system that has complete freedom of expression. I think perhaps in the past we may actually have in different phases of human history there may have been more freedom for freedom of expression. But as we've seen in recent years across the globe, there are many reasons to be even more careful with what you put down in print, or whether in print or online. So it's something that I've always been conscious of. As to the question about whether it's something that is personal, that you want to share, that's your own personal judgment, and different writers have different ways of making that decision. In my case, I have, I suppose you could say, written more. You could talk about poetry, written more public poems rather than private ones. I don't usually write about my most private thoughts or emotions.
Okay, so sort of going off from your like experience of working on the censorship committee. So like as a writer yourself, what is your thoughts on censorship or like banning books, stuff like that?
I was a member of the Censorship Review Committee in Singapore, which is a national committee that is assembled it used to be every 10 years, now it's every 5 years or so, to review all the censorship policies in the country, except the policies relating to the mainstream media.
Okay.
So it's not just books, but everything else, movies, internet, radio, and so on, theater even. Well, your question was about books. Well, in Singapore, books don't have there is no prior vetting, meaning you don't, if you're a publisher, you don't have to send it to anybody else to have a look before you go to print. You can just print anything you like, and then the regulation comes in if there are any public complaints about what you publish, and there have been just a few instances of that in the past, of a book that had to be withdrawn from circulation because of public complaints. Personally, I think that this is related to the earlier question about censorship, that there is a responsibility that all of us have. I mean, today it's down to every person. In the past, it was a big, well, not. I mean, it has to be it related to a publishing company that had the resources to publish something and circulate it widely. But today, it's a personal responsibility, and anyone who posts anything on an online platform like Facebook, for instance, or even your own blog, there could be consequences to what you write. So there is a personal responsibility that you have to shoulder and bear in mind. So that similar responsibility, but of course on a different scale, also applies to books. I mean, that's what I think should be the case at a fundamental level. But what I would question would be, let's say a government agency that tries to prevent the expression of something based on a small group's interests. We've had a couple of instances of that in recent years in Singapore. And that's when it becomes an issue, when it is the suppression of expression, not necessarily for the greater good of the wider public interest, but on behalf of a smaller group's interest. That's when it becomes questionable. In the past, I have argued for greater freedom for religious dissent. I mean, like for instance, someone like for instance the British writer Salman Rushdie in his book The Satanic Verses, which was banned in Singapore, wanting to express religious doubt. I've argued in the past that if you suppress everything, then there would be less understanding, and that's an issue that is still very much on the agenda in many countries across the world now.
So, as you said earlier on, you have like a portfolio career, and like how do you balance your interest for writing and literature with your different careers that you have?
Well, the portfolio career gives me time to pursue my literary interests. Okay. Sometimes you get a small honorarium if you speak at a festival, or a small sum in terms of royalties from the books that you publish, but you can't make a living from writing poetry or publishing literature alone. So you have to, and in my case, do all the other types of writing, so I just try to balance my time between the different projects. But I'm always grateful that this current arrangement it gives me time to pursue my literary and now more recently artistic interests as well.
Can you give young like teenage poets any advice for like writing poetry, or like just having a more in-depth understanding for literature?
I would say that if you have an interest in it, you should pursue it, because it would be a terrible waste if you don't develop your talent. So keep at it. Read as much as you can of other writers, and not necessarily only your culture, but read from other cultures as well, because there are poets in almost every culture has their poets. Some of them are available in translation, And now with the internet, there's really no limit and no excuse not to explore. I mean, it's just within 2 or 3 minutes, you could be reading a poet from Colombia in translation. So, and finding what all common strands of humanity, different ways of expression which you can learn from and adapt to your own art. Yeah. So keep at it. And I think that one of the greatest skills is the power of observation. I think not everybody has it. I mean, in fact, most people don't have it. I mean, like you could, for instance, a simple example is if you watch a movie with someone else, and you may spot something which the other person completely misses, even though it's right there in your face on screen. So if you could find some way of developing that power, that skill, then it's a very useful advantage to have for a writer and for any artist.
Okay, and my last question here is, if you could give your younger self a piece of advice, what would you tell him?
I would say try to make the most of every opportunity that's available to you. So that's how I live my life now. I mean, like in every day, I plan my day and I know I have this much time. And the hours are limited. And life is short. The time that we have is finite. I think you now call it YOLO, right? You only live once. Yeah. So I look back with some regret on my younger self and how I could have used the time to do more. I mean, write more, publish more, think of more innovative, wonderful ideas that you could. I mean, if you had thought about it earlier, then you've done something about it, you could have built on it, and you could have built it up to something even greater by now. Yeah. So make the most of the opportunities that you have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.